Hello there, Professor Zeeb here again, and welcome to our short lecture on families and parenting. You know, this is going to be a great section for our parents out there and parents-to-be, which obviously is most of us. So we're going to look at some research regarding different parenting styles based on a famous study and look at different types of parents. So let's get started here. Let's go to our slides. All right, so we're going to look at families and development. Let's kind of set this up and give you some background here. So remember, the reason we're even spending time talking about this is because we know that families and parents definitely affect our developmental course. So it's well worth the time to kind of go over it here. Here's some things to kind of remember as we go through this section. Each family is definitely unique in terms of the dynamic, you know, the type of family, culture. So thus, it's really hard to kind of create one sort of equation that fits every single family, because obviously we have intact families, divorced families, single parents, foster parents, same-sex couples. The point is that we have many diverse types of families, so it's really hard to kind of talk about them uniformly, but we're going to look at some different parenting styles and some research that hopefully will connect to some of those types. Also keep in mind that parents and children influence each other. It's not just the parents influencing the children. If you guys remember from before, we talked about reciprocal interactions. So that's kind of what we're referring to. So remember, it kind of goes both ways. Parents can affect their kids, kids can affect their parents, and vice versa, and so on, and round and round we go. Also keep in mind, one of the reasons it's important to talk about this is because family experiences can have both negative and positive effects on children later down the road. So obviously it's really important to kind of understand this stuff and knowing that sometimes the way you raise your children obviously can have long-lasting impacts on children's behavior. So important, once again, it's important to kind of go over this stuff. And lastly, keep in mind that parenting takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. It is not an easy thing. It's certainly not an easy job for two people, let alone one person in a single parent sort of situation. So it is very difficult work and a full-time job in and of itself. All right, so let's go to some research here. We're going to look at what we refer to as Diane Baumrein's parenting styles. So Diane Baumrein conducted some research on parenting behavior and children's competence. In other words, she identified different parenting styles or types of parents and then made connections to those children later on down the road, which we'll kind of look at in Canvas here, okay? Here's some things to keep in mind as we go through this study. Remember that most of our samples were white middle-class families. So does that apply to everyone in our country? Certainly not. The sample is pretty limited, so you have to kind of keep that in mind. In other words, it may not generalize to other populations. There are certainly no cause and effect relationships between the parenting categories that we're going to discuss and some of the child characteristics. So I don't want you to kind of come away from this lecture and this section in the class thinking that if I'm this type of parent, it's going to cause this type of child. I mean, certainly that could happen, but remember, it's correlational data. So there's no cause and effect in play here, as we've discussed earlier on in the course. You also have to remember that a child's temperament is going to be huge in this and obviously can create changes, you know, as we discussed temperament before. Lastly, cultural variations are present. Obviously, culture really reflects a lot of these styles and what's considered to be appropriate and not. So you have to kind of think about that as we kind of go through the information. All right, so let's go through our different parenting types and behavior. So remember, Baumrein found certain patterns in parenting styles, and I want you to kind of think about each one and kind of reflect on your own life, possibly, you know, was this how my parents raised me? Is this the type of parent I am when I'm raising my children and so forth? So the first type of parent is called the authoritarian parent, okay? The way I kind of think about these guys, if you think authoritarian, it's kind of like a disciplinarian. To me, that's how I memorized it in college. But anyway, these are very strict and demanding parents. In other words, they demand instant obedience. It's my way or the highway. So in other words, there's no monkey business involved here. It's kind of like I have rules, you follow them, and if you don't, you face the consequences. So very strict, very demanding. No explanation in the rules of the household. So there are definitely rules of conduct present in the home, which is a great thing. But the problem is there's no room for negotiation. There's no explanation of why this rule is even there in the first place. They don't want to listen to the child's, side of the story. I mean, obviously that could matter in my opinion. So no explanations for the rules. In fact, no consideration to the child's views during conflicts. In other words, they don't want to hear why you broke the rule. There's no explanation for these rules. And Baumrind even found that children could be punished just for asking about the rules. So the point is, this type of parent is sort of a no-nonsense parent, very strict, lots of rules and consequences. The parent is basically running the show to a very extreme degree. And sometimes children can be punished just for questioning their authority. So that's the type of parent we're talking about. Let's go on to our next one, which is one I really want to recommend. So this is the one the research really supports. This is how I personally raise my kids. Obviously, you can make up your own decisions, but I really want to advocate this one. And it's called the authoritative type parent, okay? Keep in mind as we go through this, of all the different types that we're going to talk about, this is the one that's linked with self-confidence and has the most positive findings in research overall in connection to the children. So when we look at children who come out of this, remember it's not cause and effect. It is correlated, but those correlations seem to be overly positive, meaning that it's a good thing. Is kind of what we mean by that. All right, number one, we know that these parents are nurturing. So we already said in the class and covered that this is very important for children to have in this relationship, to be loved. So in other words, these are parents that are warm and loving and feel that is very important. And obviously it is important in my opinion. These parents place maturity demands on their kids. In other words, what I mean by that is they expect them to act their age. In other words, there are certainly rules, but those rules are going to be catered towards the child's age. So for example, if I have a teenager, my rules may be a little bit more flexible than say a 5-year-old. So the point is that they're going to expect them to act their age regardless of what that age is. And those rules could be flexible and changed accordingly. One thing I really like about this one is the clarity of communication. So these are the parents that sit down and have the talk with you. Now I know as a child that sometimes that's a drag, and it's kind of a difficult thing, but these are the parents that actually sit down with you. They explain the rules. They explain why the rules are important, which is so important for kids to understand. This is why I don't want you doing this because this could happen. So in other words, the children are really understanding why that rule is there in the first place and why I need to be following it. So they kind of make that, that connection. Kids need that structure. They need to learn those rules because if I don't say anything about it, they may not make the correct assumptions about the rule in the first place. So these parents explain the reasons for rules and the need for control. They also respond to the needs and wishes of the children. So I think that's very important. They're going to listen to what the child has to say. Why did you break this rule, for example? Oh, okay, well, maybe you should have done it better this way. In other words, they're willing to listen because sometimes the situation can change things. So they're going to listen to the child's needs and wishes and take that into account. But certainly there are rules and consequences, so don't get me wrong. In fact, these parents do enforce rules. In other words, they do punish. But the difference is with our first type of parent is that these punishments are coupled with explanation. So that is so important to not just thrash on your kids when they do something wrong. You want to explain why it's wrong so they understand that. So the point is, guys, if they don't learn that, it's going to be a hard lesson down the road once they become an adult because they may not understand why we need to control our behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, there are definite standards that need to be followed, and these standards are explained clearly to the child. Lastly, These parents encourage independence. Remember, we already said that's important with Erickson. So they're going to respect both socialization, being an individual, so they honor that and cherish that. But at the same time, you have to follow the rules. You have to kind of go with the program, so to speak, and that is explained clearly to the child. So really, I like this one because it has a lot of positive benefits. In fact, of all the types that we're going to talk about once again, this one is linked with the most pro-social behaviors. So in other words, it's really advocating good behavior, acceptable behavior overall. All right, our third type of parent is called indulgent. Another way to kind of think about that is a permissive parent, meaning passive parenting. So some of us can kind of think about people that we know that kind of follow this sort of strategy. Passive parenting, meaning a laissez-faire type strategy where they're not really involved in the parenting. For example, they're very tolerant and very accepting, which is a great thing. Obviously, you need to do that as a parent. But the problem is the behavior could be completely inappropriate or unacceptable. You know, even if that behavior is aggressive or overly sexual, for example, where clearly it should not be. These are the types of parents that accept that. You know, they, even though it's wrong in most people's opinions, this is the parent that sort of takes it with a grain of salt and accept those particular behaviors. In fact, the research also showed that they rarely punished. So even if a child is breaking the rules and it's clearly wrong, these parents accept that and there are no consequences. See guys, the problem with that is that children are going to learn that hard lesson down the road when they become adults and they're away from their parents. You know, these are the kids that potentially could end up in jail or they're facing consequences in society because they were never punished. They were never held in check or held responsible for their actions potentially. So this one can be kind of dangerous in my opinion. Baumrind also found that the kids in this situation were often making most of the decisions. Excuse me. In other words, the kids are calling the shots. They are running the show. So guys, to me, that's not parenting. You have to be the authority figure. You have to be the one in control of your children's behavior. You can't expect them to make up their own decisions and make up their own minds about things. I mean, certainly as they get older, that would be more appropriate, but this could include younger children where they're just running wild. We've all seen those kids out in public where the parents are just sitting there doing nothing and the kids are acting inappropriately. So to me, once again, I don't agree with this particular style. I understand it, but I would argue against it in my opinion. Like I said, you guys make up your own mind. All right, our last type of parent, these are called neglectful parents. Sometimes we would explain them as being sort of uninvolved in the child's life. So these particular parents are detached from their children's lives. So for example, they may neglect them or even reject their own children, which is obviously a very sad thing. Few demands are placed on the children. That would make sense if they're not even in the child's life. You know, how can they be placing demands on them? Little communication, so they're not really talking to them, they're not reaching out. To me, what sort of comes to mind, in my opinion, for this one is a divorce situation where this parent is the one without custody and they're bitter about the situation, so maybe they don't want to be involved in their child's life because it reminds them of their divorced spouse, for example, or maybe this is a way of getting back at their divorced spouse, if you would. So to me, the point is with this one is that they're very uninvolved. They're sort of detached from that child's life and they don't want anything to do with them. Once again, kids need that structure. They need that connection. They need that sort of emotional bond with their biological parents, in my opinion. So to have a parent that's choosing not to be involved for whatever reason, that's just a very sad situation. And to me, in my opinion, once again, that could lead to emotional scars down the road. Once again, that's completely my opinion, but I kind of see that happening as they sort of consider and ponder this type of parent. All right, so this will conclude our short lecture on families and parenting styles. Please go on to the next part of the class.